The morning sun cast long shadows across Lakewood Estates, a neighborhood that existed less as a collection of homes and more as a meticulously curated illusion of perfection. Each house stood like a precisely placed chess piece, uniform, controlled, without a single blade of grass daring to grow out of line. Karen Matthews pulled into her driveway, her Mercedes convertible purring softly as she killed the engine. At 42, she was a force of nature in the local real estate market, known for her ability to close deals that seemed impossible. Her husband Tom often joked that she could sell ice to Eskimos, but Karen knew her success came from something far more fundamental: attention to detail. Their home was a beautiful craftsman-style house at the corner of Maple and Willow, a property that had cost them nearly every penny of their savings. Tom, an architect with a passion for historic restoration, had fallen in love with the home's original woodwork and carefully preserved architectural details. Karen had seen the potential immediately, not just as a home, but as a statement. Lakewood Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a lifestyle, a statement of social status, a carefully constructed ecosystem of conformity and control. The community had been developed 15 years ago by a consortium of local developers, with Victor Hardcastle emerging as its most prominent and powerful resident. Victor was a retired naval commander who approached community management with the same rigid discipline he'd once applied to military operations. At 68, he was a lean, perpetually tanned figure who seemed to have been born wearing pressed khaki pants and a crisp polo shirt. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his posture ramrod straight, a living embodiment of discipline and order. The welcome to Lakewood Estates wasn't just a move-in experience, it was an indoctrination. When Karen and Tom first purchased their home, they received more than just a set of keys. A welcome package arrived, meticulously prepared, professionally printed, and bound in a leather-like folder that screamed official importance. Inside was a 47-page community handbook that made most legal documents look simplistic by comparison. The handbook covered everything, and when Karen said everything, she meant everything. Section 3, Paragraph 2 detailed acceptable lawn grass types, only 3 varieties permitted. Section 5 outlined precise guidelines for exterior paint colors, a pre-approved palette of 8 muted tones. Section 7 provided exhaustive rules about landscaping, with subsections dedicated to the exact height of shrubs, the permitted varieties of flowering plants, and the precise angle at which trees could be trimmed. Tom had laughed when he first read it. "This is more regulated than my architectural blueprints," he joked. Karen wasn't laughing. Her rare orchid collection, plants she'd cultivated for over a decade, some worth thousands of dollars, represented her most treasured hobby. Delicate, exotic specimens that required precise care and represented years of passionate cultivation. Plants that had traveled with her from their previous home, surviving multiple relocations and thriving under her expert care. The first warning came exactly 1 week after they moved in. A crisp, official envelope arrived in their mailbox. No personal greeting, no congratulations on their new home. Just an official letterhead from the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association, addressed precisely to K. Matthews, resident. The violation was absurd. Her prized orchids, carefully arranged on the front porch in custom ceramic planters, were positioned 3 inches outside the approved decorative perimeter as outlined in Section 7, subsection C of the community guidelines. 3 inches, Karen muttered, reading the letter for the 3rd time. They're sending an official warning over 3 inches. Tom peered over her shoulder, his architectural eye already calculating. Technically, they're right. The guidelines are very specific. But Karen wasn't listening. Her mind was already racing, calculating. In her years of real estate, she'd dealt with difficult clients, impossible negotiations, complex property disputes. This was just another challenge. Little did Victor Hardcastle know, Karen Matthews wasn't someone who backed down easily, and this was only the beginning. The war for Lakewood Estates was about to begin. The Mercedes was more than just a car. It was a piece of automotive history, a 1989 Sol class that represented years of Tom's passion and precision. Every weekend, he'd spend hours in the garage, meticulously maintaining the vehicle. The silver blue paint gleamed like a mirror, the chrome details catching the sunlight with a vintage elegance that spoke of a bygone era of automotive craftsmanship. Victor Hardcastle's next communication was anything but subtle. The envelope arrived mid-morning, its official whole letterhead practically vibrating with bureaucratic intensity. Karen recognized the paper stock immediately, the same high-quality, watermarked paper used in their original welcome packet. But this time, the contents were decidedly less welcoming. Official community standards violation. The header screamed in bold, blood-red letters. The list of infractions was comprehensive, almost comically detailed. 1. Non-standard vehicle coloration. The silver blue paint was deemed inconsistent with community aesthetic guidelines. Specific complaint. Metallic finish creates unacceptable light reflection. 2. Visible restoration markers. Minor rust spots, carefully preserved as part of the vehicle's historical authenticity. Noted as deterioration potentially indicating neglect. 3. Parking location violation. Vehicle positioned outside of approved parking zones. Driveway placement deemed visually disruptive to neighborhood uniformity. The fine was breathtaking in its audacity. $500, with a 30-day notice to either fully restore the vehicle to showroom condition or remove it from the property entirely. Tom was the first to see the letter. His architect's mind began breaking down the absurdity of the claims. "They're essentially saying we can't park our own car on our own property," he muttered, tracing his finger along the meticulously typed lines. Karen's response was more calculated. She understood bureaucracy, had navigated its complex waters in her real estate career for years. This wasn't just a random warning. This was a power play. She spent the next week assembling a comprehensive portfolio. Professional photographs documented every inch of the Mercedes, highlighting its historical significance. She obtained a detailed restoration certificate from a renowned classic car preservation society. Expert testimonials praised the vehicle's condition, its historical accuracy, its value as a preserved piece of automotive heritage. The monthly whole meeting became her battlefield. The community center where they held these meetings was a monument to suburban conformity. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, rows of identical chairs arranged with military precision. Victor Hardcastle sat at the front table, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd been selected for their ability to look simultaneously bored and judgmental. Karen approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had closed million-dollar real estate deals before breakfast. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice calm and professional. "The vehicle in question is not just a car. It's a piece of automotive history, meticulously maintained, with historical significance that extends beyond your narrow aesthetic guidelines." She laid out her documentation. Photographs showing the Mercedes' pristine condition, letters from preservation societies, detailed restoration records that would make a museum curator weep with joy. Victor Hardcastle's response was ice cold. "Ms. Matthews," he said, his voice a perfect mixture of condescension and military precision, "historical significance means nothing if it contradicts community standards. The vehicle is an eyesore and must be addressed." The board members nodded in unison, a choreographed display of bureaucratic solidarity. But Karen saw something else, a flicker in Victor's eyes, not just determination, but something deeper. A personal vendetta that went beyond mere community guidelines. This was more than a parking dispute. This was a battle of wills. And Karen Matthews had never lost a battle in her life. As she gathered her documents, Tom watching from the back of the room with a mixture of admiration and concern, she knew this was just the beginning. The war with Lakewood Estates Hull had officially begun. The fines arrived like clockwork. First $500, then $1,000, then $2,500. Each letter was more threatening than the last, each envelope a crisp reminder of the HOA's relentless pursuit. Victor Hardcastle seemed to take personal pleasure in crafting these communications, keying multiple board members and adding increasingly baroque language about community aesthetic integrity. But Karen wasn't alone in her struggle. Robert Collins lived 2 doors down, a retired electrical engineer with a workshop that was his pride and joy. Meticulously organized, filled with custom electronics and restoration projects, it was a testament to precision and passion, and it was precisely the kind of space that made Victor Hardcastle's skin crawl. Their first conversation happened on a crisp Saturday morning. Karen was checking her mail, another HOA letter, no doubt, when Robert approached, holding a similar envelope. "I see you've been receiving love letters from our beloved HOA," Robert said, his voice dry with sarcasm. Karen raised an eyebrow. Love letters is one way to put it. Robert's workshop had been cited for excessive noise and unsightly equipment visibility. The violations were as ridiculous as they were specific. A custom-built oscilloscope visible through the workshop window. The sound of precision tools during quiet hours. A workbench that allegedly protruded 2.3 inches beyond the approved workspace perimeter. "They've been after me for years," Robert explained, showing Karen a file folder that was bursting with correspondence. "Every project, every modification, they find something." Together, they began to dig. Robert's engineering background proved invaluable. He had a methodical approach to gathering evidence that would make a forensic accountant proud. They discovered a pattern of selective enforcement that was nothing short of shocking. Certain homeowners seemed immune to HOA scrutiny. The Collins family 2 blocks over had a rusted pickup truck perpetually parked on their lawn. The Hendersons had exterior paint that was clearly outside the approved color palette. Yet no warnings, no fines, no letters. But Karen and Robert targeted with surgical precision. Financial records told an even more disturbing story. The HOA's annual reports showed fund allocations that raised more red flags than a communist parade. Contracts awarded to companies with suspiciously close ties to board members. Maintenance projects that seemed to cost 3 times what they should. "Look at this," Robert said one evening, spreading documents across Karen's dining room table. Tom brought over glasses of wine, becoming an unofficial third member of their investigative team. A landscaping contract showed $75,000 for what should have been a $25,000 project. The company was owned by Victor Hardcastle's nephew. Another maintenance contract for community areas was similarly inflated, awarded to a business with a post office box registered to the HOA treasurer's wife. This isn't just about rules, Karen realized. This is about control and money. The fines continued to mount. Victor seemed to become more aggressive with each passing week. A new set of bylaws appeared, more complex and restrictive than ever before. Penalties for violations became increasingly severe. Parking became a minefield. Vehicle restrictions tightened. Landscaping guidelines became so specific that a single misplaced leaf could trigger a fine. The Mercedes remained a primary target, with increasingly creative violations being invented to justify additional penalties. But Karen and Robert were no longer just defending themselves. They were building a case. They began gathering signatures from other homeowners, quietly at first, then more openly. People who had lived in fear of the HOA began to speak up. Stories of petty harassment, of arbitrary fines, of a community held hostage by bureaucratic tyranny. Robert created a spreadsheet, meticulously documented, with dates, amounts, comparative analyses. Karen used her real estate network to dig deeper, to find connections, to understand the full scope of the HOA's overreach. Victor Hardcastle had made a critical mistake. He turned a simple parking dispute into a full-scale investigation. And Karen Matthews was just getting started. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday. Not just any foreclosure notice. A meticulously crafted legal document that read like a weapon disguised as paperwork. Victor Hardcastle had finally played his ultimate card, threatening to seize the Matthews home over accumulated HOA fines and continuous violation of community standards. The total amount cited was astronomical, $47,635.82. Breakdown of the charges read like a bureaucratic nightmare. Parking violations, Mercedes, $12,500. Landscaping non-compliance, $8,750. Exterior aesthetic violations, $15,600. Administrative fees, $10,100. $185.82. Tom found Karen in his home office, the document spread across his drafting table. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a cold, calculated rage that he recognized all too well. "They're not just trying to find us," Karen said, her voice eerily calm. "They're trying to destroy us." The attack was strategic. Victor knew Karen's entire professional reputation was built on her real estate expertise. A foreclosure would be more than a financial blow. It would be a professional death sentence. No client would trust a real estate agent who couldn't protect her own home. Robert Collins discovered something even more sinister. Through his network of retired professionals, he'd uncovered a pattern. The HOA had been systematically targeting homeowners who didn't fit their narrow definition of community standard. Older residents, those with unique professions, anyone who stood out. An elderly widow whose garden didn't meet precise maintenance requirements. A mixed-race couple whose home decorations were deemed culturally inappropriate. A software engineer whose home office equipment was considered unsightly. "It's not just about rules," Robert told Karen and Tom over dinner. "It's about control, maintaining a very specific vision of what this community should look like." The foreclosure notice was just the tip of the iceberg. Victor had begun mobilizing the HOA board, pushing through emergency bylaws that would make challenging their decisions nearly impossible. Meetings became closed-door affairs. Communication channels were restricted. Homeowners who questioned anything were quickly silenced with legal threats. Karen's real estate connections proved invaluable. She began reaching out, quietly gathering information, building a network of support. Sarah Reynolds, a local investigative journalist, became their unexpected ally. A Pulitzer Prize finalist known for exposing community corruption, she saw in the Lakewood Estates HOA a story that could be her next major breakthrough. "This goes deeper than just one neighborhood," Sarah told Karen during a clandestine meeting at a local coffee shop. "I've seen similar patterns in other communities. It's a systematic approach to community control." The evidence began to mount. Financial records showing kickbacks, selective enforcement that bordered on harassment, a web of connections that suggested the HOA was more than just a neighborhood management organization. It was a sophisticated machine of economic and social control. Tom, usually the more measured of the two, surprised everyone with his response. "We're not just fighting for our home," he said, spreading out architectural blueprints and HOA documents across their dining room table. "We're fighting for every homeowner who's been silenced, every person who's been told they don't belong." Karen looked at her husband, a spark of something dangerous and beautiful growing in her eyes. Victor Hardcastle had made a critical mistake. He'd turned this from a simple dispute into an existential battle. And in doing so, he'd awakened something far more dangerous than a simple homeowner. He'd awakened Karen Matthews. The war was about to begin in earnest. The war room, as Tom had begun to call it, was their home office, a space that had transformed from an architectural workspace to the nerve center of their resistance. Corkboards covered the walls, connected by a web of red strings that mapped out the HOA's intricate network of corruption. Robert's engineering precision met Karen's real estate investigative skills, creating a documentary evidence system that would make a federal prosecutor proud. Sarah Reynolds arrived with her first major breakthrough. "This," she said, dropping a thick manila folder onto the dining room table, "is going to change everything." The documents were a treasure trove of investigative gold. Financial records that showed a complex shell game of HOA funds, contracts awarded to shell companies, kickbacks carefully disguised as legitimate business transactions. Each page revealed another layer of Victor Hardcastle's carefully constructed facade. The most damning evidence centered on a series of maintenance contracts. What should have been standard community upkeep was actually a sophisticated money laundering operation. Victor's nephew's landscaping company, the HOA treasurer's wife's maintenance business, a network of seemingly legitimate companies that were anything but. "Look at this," Robert said, his finger tracing a complicated financial trail. "These contracts are inflated by at least 300%, and they're cycling the money through multiple accounts." Karen was already working her network. Years of real estate connections were proving invaluable. She reached out to state-level housing authorities, legal experts specializing in HOA regulations, and investigative bodies that could substantiate their claims. The first official complaint was a masterpiece of legal precision, drafted with the help of a pro bono attorney who saw the case as a potential landmark in HOA regulation. It was a comprehensive document that laid bare every single irregularity. But they knew Victor wouldn't go down without a fight. The OO's response was swift and predictable. Additional fines began to arrive. Threatening letters multiplied. They were trying to bury Karen and Tom in paperwork, to drain their resources and spirit. Instead, it only fueled their determination. Social media became an unexpected weapon. Robert, despite being in his late 60s, understood digital platforms better than most millennials. He began documenting their journey, carefully, strategically. Screen captures of HOA documents, detailed explanations of each violation, a narrative that transformed their personal battle into a community movement. Their first viral post came unexpectedly. A video of the Mercedes, the very car that started everything, meticulously maintained, with Robert providing a technical breakdown of why every single HOA complaint was not just wrong, but scientifically impossible. The video hit 2 million views in 48 hours. Homeowners from across the state began reaching out. Similar stories of HOA harassment poured in. A retired teacher in Arizona, a young couple in Minnesota, a disabled veteran in Florida. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: small, power-hungry boards using bureaucracy as a weapon. Sarah's first article in the county newspaper was a bombshell. Lakewood Estates, a community held hostage, read the headline. She methodically dismantled the HOA's credibility, presenting hard evidence of systematic harassment and financial misconduct. Victor Hardcastle's response was telling. Instead of addressing the allegations, he attempted to shut down the narrative. Legal threats were sent to the newspaper. Attempts were made to discredit Sarah, to challenge the sources. But the dam had broken. State housing authorities began an official investigation. The Attorney General's office showed interest. What had started as a dispute over a classic car had become something much larger, a potential landmark case about community governance, power, and accountability. Karen looked at Tom, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. "We're not just fighting for our home anymore," she said. "We're fighting for every homeowner who's ever been silenced." The fight was just beginning. The cracks in the HOA's facade began to appear subtly at first, like hairline fractures in a once perfect facade. 2 board members, Jennifer Lawson and Michael Chen, were the first to break ranks. Jennifer, a local elementary school teacher, had always been uncomfortable with Victor Hardcastle's increasingly aggressive tactics. Michael, a young software engineer who'd been pressured into the board position, had been collecting his own evidence of financial irregularities. Their private communications began to leak. Emails that revealed the inner workings of the HOA's decision-making process painted a damning picture. Discussions about problematic homeowners, strategies for maintaining what they called community standards, a euphemism that barely concealed their true intentions. Victor's response was predictably aggressive. He called an emergency board meeting, attempting to push through emergency bylaws that would make challenging the HOA's decisions nearly impossible. The proposed changes were breathtaking in their audacity. Increased fines for repeated violations, restrictions on homeowners' ability to challenge board decisions, expanded powers for immediate property liens, limitations on external communication about HOA matters. But Jennifer and Michael had other plans. They arrived at the meeting with a USB drive that would change everything. Months of carefully collected documentation, financial records, email chains, recorded conversations, all meticulously organized and preserved. The board meeting descended into chaos. Victor's face turned various shades of red as the evidence was presented. Financial discrepancies that he'd carefully hidden for years were suddenly laid bare. Kickback schemes, inflated contracts, selective enforcement that bordered on systematic harassment. "You've been using the HOA as your personal piggy bank," Jennifer said, her voice calm and measured. "And we have proof." The other board members began to distance themselves. Some looked shocked. Others looked terrified. A few looked like they were calculating their own potential legal exposure. Sarah Reynolds was waiting outside with her camera crew. The moment the board members emerged, she was there. "Care to comment on the allegations of financial misconduct?" she asked, her microphone thrust forward. Victor attempted to push past, but the damage was already done. His attempts to avoid questioning only made him look more guilty. Social media exploded. The videos went viral within hours. Screenshots of financial documents, recordings of board meetings, a comprehensive timeline of the HOA's systemic abuse of power. Robert's technical expertise proved crucial. He'd been collecting digital evidence for months: IP logs, email trails, financial transaction records. Each piece of documentation was meticulously verified, cross-referenced, bulletproof. Karen's real estate network kicked into high gear. Colleagues who had heard whispers of similar HOA abuses across the state began to come forward. What had started as the Matthews personal battle was becoming a statewide investigation. The State Housing Authority initiated a formal investigation. The Attorney General's office began collecting documents. Local media picked up the story, with each new revelation more shocking than the last. Victor Hardcastle's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His business connections started to dry up. The community members who had once feared him now saw him as a pariah. Even his strongest supporters began to distance themselves. "This is about more than just one neighborhood," Karen told a local news reporter. "This is about holding those in power accountable." The HOA board started to fragment. Some members resigned. Others lawyered up. Victor found himself increasingly isolated, his decades of bureaucratic control slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Tom watched his wife with a mixture of admiration and slight terror. "You're enjoying this a little too much," he said one evening as they reviewed the latest batch of documents. Karen's smile was razor sharp. "Accountability," she said, "is a beautiful thing." The final act was yet to come, but the tide had definitively turned. The state hearing room was packed. Every seat was filled, with overflow crowds standing in the hallways. What had begun as a local HOA dispute had transformed into a landmark case about community governance, power, and accountability. Karen sat at the front table, Tom beside her, Robert just behind. Sarah Reynolds occupied a press seat, her notebook open, her journalist's instinct crackling with anticipation. The panel consisted of 3 administrative law judges, each with decades of experience in municipal and community regulations. They looked like they'd seen it all, but the documentation spread before them suggested otherwise. Victor Hardcastle arrived in his usual pressed khakis, but something was different. The military precision of his posture seemed slightly diminished. His usual confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy that filled the room like static electricity. Sarah's expose had done more than just damage Victor's reputation. It had blown the entire case wide open. The financial records told a story of systematic corruption that went far beyond Lakewood Estates. Shell companies, kickback schemes, deliberate harassment of homeowners who didn't conform to a narrow, discriminatory vision of community living. Jennifer Lawson and Michael Chen testified first. Their documentation was impeccable. Months of carefully collected evidence that painted a devastating picture of the HOA's inner workings. Email chains revealed conversations that were equal parts horrifying and bizarre. Discussions about maintaining community standards that were thinly veiled attempts to control and manipulate homeowners. "It was never about rules," Jennifer said, her voice steady. "It was about power, about creating a community that looked exactly how a few people decided it should look." The state's forensic accountant presented a financial breakdown that was devastating. Millions of dollars in questionable transactions, contracts awarded to family members and close friends, a system of financial manipulation so complex it made money laundering look simple. Victor's lawyer attempted to mount a defense, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a paper umbrella. Each piece of evidence was more damning than the last. The Mercedes, the car that had started everything, became a symbol of resistance. Robert's technical analysis proved that every single complaint against the vehicle was not just wrong, but scientifically impossible. The hearing became more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning. Homeowners from across the state testified, some in person, some via video. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: HOAs that had transformed from community management organizations into tools of social control. An elderly widow who'd been fined for her garden. A mixed-race couple harassed for non-standard home decorations. A disabled veteran targeted for modifications to make his home accessible. Karen's testimony was the crescendo. "This isn't about a car," she said, her voice filling the hearing room. "This is about something fundamental. The right to live in your own home without fear. The right to be part of a community that welcomes diversity, that respects individual choice." The judges listened, not just with their ears, but with a growing sense of moral outrage. When Victor was called to testify, he crumbled. His attempts to defend his actions became increasingly desperate. Each explanation was more convoluted than the last. The carefully constructed facade he maintained for decades began to crack. Tom watched, his architectural mind noting how carefully constructed systems could collapse under the weight of their own complexity. The final moments of the hearing were electric. The lead judge, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen decades of bureaucratic maneuvering, looked directly at Victor. "Mr. Hardcastle," she said, "you've turned a community management organization into a personal fiefdom. That ends today." The ruling was comprehensive. The Lakewood Estates of OA would be completely dissolved. A state-appointed management team would take over. Victor and several board members would be barred from future community leadership positions. As they left the hearing room, Karen looked at Tom and Robert. They had won, but this was about more than just a victory. This was about justice. 6 months after the hearing, Lakewood Estates was unrecognizable. The state-appointed management team had transformed the community from a bureaucratic prison into something resembling an actual neighborhood. Bylaws were simplified. Community events were introduced. Homeowners who had once lived in fear now sat on advisory boards, their voices finally heard. The Mercedes remained, but not in the way anyone had expected. Tom's architectural genius and Karen's creative spirit had transformed the vintage car into something extraordinary. Mounted precisely on the front lawn, it became a community art installation. Solar panels integrated into its restored body-powered landscape lighting. Native plants grew around its carefully preserved frame, creating a living monument to resistance. Victor Hardcastle wasn't entirely defeated, but he was close to it. Stripped of his HOA position, banned from community leadership, he'd become a local pariah. His business connections had evaporated. The network of power he carefully constructed over decades had crumbled like a house of cards. Sarah Reynolds won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series on HOA corruption. The expose had sparked statewide reforms, with new legislation proposed to prevent similar abuses of power. Robert Collins became an unexpected community leader. His technical expertise and commitment to justice made him a sought-after advisor for community governance reform. The workshop that had once been a point of contention became a community resource center, teaching local residents about their rights and community management. The lawsuit settlement was substantial, not just for Karen and Tom, but for several other homeowners who had been systematically harassed. The state mandated comprehensive reforms in HOA governance, creating new oversight mechanisms that would prevent future abuses. But the real victory was something less tangible. Neighborhoods across the state began to reassess their community guidelines. Homeowners started asking questions. The myth of the all-powerful HOA began to crumble. On the 1-year anniversary of the hearing, the community gathered for a block party. Where once there had been rigid conformity, now there was diversity. Different architectural styles, varied landscaping, people celebrating their individuality. The Mercedes stood as a centerpiece, part art installation, part memorial, part symbol of resistance. Karen found Tom looking at the car one evening, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We could move," he said, "after everything." Karen laughed. "And miss watching this community grow? Not a chance." Victor made one last, desperate attempt at revenge. He filed a frivolous lawsuit against Karen Tom, and the state-appointed management team. It was quickly dismissed, with the court not only throwing out the case but imposing sanctions for frivolous litigation. The local news did a follow-up story. Lakewood Estates, from conformity to community, read the headline. What had started as a dispute over a classic car had become something much larger. A reminder that systemic change begins with individual resistance. That bureaucracy is not infallible. That sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is persistence, creativity, and an unwillingness to back down. Tom hung a small plaque near the Mercedes installation. Its inscription was simple. Resistance is not futile. It is essential. As the sun set on Lakewood Estates, the Mercedes caught the last rays of light, a gleaming testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced. The other way was dead. Long live the community.